Hi, I'm Scott Postma, and in this video, I'm going to talk about modernism in literature and culture. This is a lecture for the Gateway to the Great Book series, and we'll be talking about the literary enterprises of the modernist period, what the modernist period looks like, and who are some of the writers that we'll be encountering, who sort of represents the modernist period, both in art and literature, primarily in literature. So let's go ahead and get started, and we're going to be talking about modernism itself to begin with. And when we think of modernism, the first thing that I want you to be aware of is that we're not to confuse modernism as an ism, as an ideology, or as a concept, not to be confused with contemporary. Now, that's not to say that modernism is in itself a kind of ideology. Rather, it represents a way of looking at the world, a period of time in which new things were coming on the scene that influenced and shaped the way people thought about the world, primarily about art and literature and culture itself. And so let's not confuse that with contemporary. When you think of, I've got a modern car, I have a modern house, or work in a modern factory or something like that, we're not talking about the fact that it is contemporary with our time. We're talking about this particular ideology and movement. Now, as a historical period, it's very difficult to determine when modernism began and when modernism ended. In a lecture called De Descriptione Temporum by C.S. Lewis, he talks about the fact that the only real periods in history are those periods between our wake time, when we go to sleep. Otherwise, periods are designed by historians, and literary critics, so that we can think about ideas that have influenced in certain time periods. We have to sort of put bookends on these time periods so we can get some concept of when one idea begins to fade and another idea sort of takes its place. And Francis Schaeffer wisely gave us the notion that all of history has a flow to it. So one idea typically displaces another idea. Now, roughly as a historical period, some have looked at the 1890s to 1950, or more specifically, 1901 with the death of Victoria to 1945, which is the end of World War II. That's one way of looking at the modernist period. But another way, and one that I actually like better, is to look at the period from 1789 to 1989. And what's so significant about this period? Well, 1789 is the fall of the Bastille, the storming of the Bastille that's launched the French Revolution. And it's sort of set off a revolutionary spirit that would move itself into the 19th century and the 20th century. So we might think about the Bolshevik Revolution and Chairman Mao, the Chinese People's Revolution. We might think about Pol Pot in Cambodia. And I mentioned the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, Stalin and Lenin. And then 1989 reflects or represents the time period in which the Berlin Wall fell, where East and West had been divided during this Cold War period. Technically, the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, but the tearing down of the wall, if you remember Reagan, I think in 1988 said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. 1989, it was fairly demolished, and for all practical purposes, the modern period had ended. So somewhere in the late 1700s to the early 1900s, we look at this period called modernism. And the period of the 20th century sort of represents the culmination of thought and the actual transference from modernism to what we would call postmodernism, something we're not going to get into too much in this lecture. Now, modernism was also, so there's a time period, it represented a rejection of the past. So religious views and values, primarily Christianity or Christendom, as it had influenced and animated Western thought, was now seen to be unnecessary, superfluous, and really superstitious. And so there was a rejection of Christianity and the values that came with it, including some of the Victorian morality. And there was a rejection with that, rejection of artistic conventions. So if we go back to someone like Thomas Aquinas, who gave us a picture of beauty needing to be in proportion, to have integrity and to have clarity, that which pleases and delights when you look at it because of those attributes, was sort of the definition of beauty. But in the modernist period, the question is, who says it has to be that way? Isn't that just an arbitrary, just a made-up idea that one man came to his conclusions about this? And so maybe we can reject these conventions and maybe we can do some new things. Famously, a fellow by the name of Ezra Pound, that we'll look at in a moment, wrote an essay and sort of launched the mantra in the early 1900s, make it new. So that means in art and literature, no more going back to those conventions that that Thomas Aquinas sort of laid out for most of Western tradition. And so we can abandon those. And we can also abandon some of the literary concepts of looking at the classics, looking at things like virtue and nobility and the aristocracy, and looking at things like royalty. We want to avoid those things. We want to dismiss this sort of system, and let's do things new. Let's make new kinds of art. Let's write new kinds of literature. Let's make new kinds of music, those that don't follow these conventions that have really shaped the Western tradition for so long. Now, another thing that characterizes the modern period is something we call progress. In that same essay I mentioned that C.S. Lewis wrote, was actually a lecture he gave and then later put into print, De Descriptione Temporum. It means on the description of times. He talks about a shift in thinking from rulers whose job really was to curtail sin, to execute justice, to leadership in politics. So no longer was it rulers, it was leaders. We want progress. We want the state to take on more responsibility for the flourishing of human beings, for the equality that we are seeking in a democratic sort of mindset. And so there developed something C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. And this chronological snobbery goes both ways, that an idea is either better, depending on who you're talking to, it's better because it's newer, or it's better because it's simply older, and not looking at an idea based on the merits of itself. And so progress becomes sort of the chronological snobbery of the modern man. Progress is what it's all about. We want new technology, new kinds of government, new kinds of art, and we want to progress. We want to move out of just being, and we want to become something. Another concept that sort of represents modernism is what we would call empiricism and rationalism. Now, this is born out of the Enlightenment that we'll talk about in a moment, but empiricism says we need to be able to prove it. We need to hold these hard, cold facts in our hand, be able to look at them, and anything that falls outside the purview of what we can touch, taste, feel, smell, see, these things cannot be. We can't attribute reality to them. So that means supernatural things like God or heaven and hell. And so if you can hold it in your hand, if you can verify it by facts and data, then we can call it real. Rationalism relied on human reason to do a similar thing. So we don't need revelation from God. We don't need the Christian worldview. We have facts and data, and we have human reason, and this is what makes us a superior age. Plutarch, in the age of the Renaissance, had called everything before the Renaissance period the Dark Ages, because Enlightenment, sort of a proto-Enlightenment, was happening for some in that period. Also, another thing that characterized modernism is the rise of the machine and the rise of the state. I already mentioned that people begin to think of political work as progress as making it better for human beings rather than preserving justice and stability in the culture, executing justice so that people can actually flourish. Its job now was to actually help human beings flourish. Well, this gives rise to the corporation. It gives rise to industrialization. It gives rise to the machine. And this is some of the things that Tolkien was dealing with in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit when he talks about the rise of the machine and power. And so technology becomes forefront, paramount. And we'll talk about this in a moment, but we developed in the modern period the atom bomb. And now we have technology that we can use to control and to rule. And now the state sort of replaces God. The state is the end all to be all. A book called Leviathan, written by Thomas Hobbes in the 1600s, sort of lays out this idea that humanity is chaotic and his life is poor, nasty, short, and brutish. And so the state is the Leviathan that keeps man in control. Another fellow by the name of Rousseau, during the period that we'll talk about called the Romantic period, also comes up with this idea that the state is nothing more than the general will executed on all of people, the general will of the people. So all political laws and conventions are social constructs. And so whatever we construct for ourselves can be deconstructed, reconstructed, but the state is the ultimate authority and power. And then finally, another aspect of modernism in the culture was the reductionist view of mankind. Darwin gave us biological man by saying that we were evolved, and Marx called us an economic man, basically putting mankind into classes of bourgeoisie and proletariat, working class, and the sort of middle class or industrial class. And so man was reduced to his materialistic and economic value. He's a worker, he has labor. Darwin said he's biological, he's just evolved. And then Freud gave us psychological man, and this idea of psychoanalysis that man has latent repressed thinking, and so we need to be able to get those things out into the open now so we can find out who we really are. Maybe you've heard the terms the id and the ego and the superego. These represent the different parts of mankind. And so in the modern world, we're really concerned with the internal. What is man thinking? Who is he in his mind? And you can already begin to see some of the implications that come about when we get into the postmodern period, where now that there is no absolute truth whatsoever, things like who are you internally might determine who you should have been physically. And so we have the rise of things like transgenderism and that sort of thing in our postmodern world. But it has its roots, its latency, its embryonic form back in the modern period. So I mentioned Ezra Pound wrote the essay, Make It New. He really championed this idea of literature and art being different, being something new. And so here in this painting by Henry Matisse, we see this idea of a new kind of art, very colorful, very bright, and conceptualized in his sort of German rationalistic view. So modernism can be described as an era that's characterized by industrialization, the global adoption of capitalism, revolution, advances in science and social theories about man. I mentioned these things already. Modernists felt a growing alienation that was incompatible with Victorian morality. There was an optimism and a convention that no longer suited the modern man from the Victorian period. And so new ideas in psychology, philosophy, and political theory kindled a search for new modes of expression. In the arts, modernism is recognized by a determinate break with the past and new modes of experimentation. And this happens not just in the plastic visual arts, but also in the literary arts, as we will see shortly. So I mentioned Ezra Pound, make it new. This really was the mantra of the age. And here we have a painting by Picasso, the three musicians, and you can see what became called the Cubanism. And this idea of Cubism is this sort of integration. All these characters are integrated. You can't see where they stop and start. They are both distinct and meshed together. They are distorted. They are shapes, mechanical shapes, spatial rather than more fluid and human. And so again, this sort of characterizes the disjointed, interconnected, and yet sort of isolationist worldview of the modern man. So you're both sort of collective, integrated with everybody else, but at the same time, you have this unique identity, and this unique identity is your individualism, what's going on inside of your mind. Virginia Woolf, in an essay, famous essay, wrote that on or about December 1910, human character changed. And this is one of, again, like Ezra Pound's quote, one of those quotes that represent this modern thinking that in the 1900s, the early 20th century, something about human character just fundamentally changed. What we thought about man, how we lived, how we acted, how we behaved, how we thought about society. Everyone moved to the cities. We left the country. Corporations, business, technology, all of this began to impose itself upon the human condition. And in the back, we have an Impressionist painting by Paul Cézanne, where if you'll notice, it looks like mountains and maybe some sort of landscape, but it's all, again, in dimensional shapes and broad brushed colors. And so there's some of this impressionist idea that life is sort of vague. Yeah, it's difficult to see where the lines begin and end, and yet they are there and we can recognize them, but we don't really know where they start and stop. And this is the chaos of the modern world. So what led to modernism? Well, in a very generic overview of the historical periods that led to modernism, I want to begin with the Renaissance in the 1400s. And this is the 15th century. Renaissance is, again, a renewal of thought. In 1453, the Byzantine Empire fell, and to the Ottoman Turks. And people from the East moved west, fled to the West, bringing with them lots of texts and art from the more Greek orientation, the classical period. And so there was a revival of classicism in Italy and Europe during the 1400s. And this sort of renewal of what looks the best, what makes the most virtuous person, what is the most virtuous kind of art. And so the Renaissance began to look at man, while it didn't totally dismiss Christianity, it began to look at man as the measure of all things, or at least in part it did. And that was in the Italian Renaissance. In the Northern Renaissance, we have guys like Erasmus and Luther and later Calvin and Zwingli and other reformers. And this leads to the Reformation in the 1600s. It's a renewal of the scriptures and getting the scriptures into people's hands. And so there's these ages of renewal for the good of human flourishing. One sort of makes man the measure of all things, and another makes man the middle of all things. He is both divine, has the image of God, but he's also fallen. That's sort of the Reformational thinking. Renaissance is man can escape his fallen nature and become all that he can be because he's man. For example, Dignity of Man was a famous work during that period. Then we move into the 1600s, what we call the scientific revolution, with guys like Galileo and Johannes Kepler and Isaac Newton, and the discovery of scientific sort of thinking begins to permeate the world. Now, what's really interesting about this period is that you have men that I just mentioned who were believers, they were Christians, but because they believed that um, the world, the universe, the cosmos was designed and shaped by a creator, they believed you could explore it and understand the laws of nature by exploring and learning the laws of what we later scientific laws, motion, gravity, those things. And so they began to study those. And then in the later 1600s, early 1700s, the I'll use a term that Abraham Kuyper used. It's sort of in cut flower fashion. They took the flower but left the root of Christianity, and they begin to see man again as sort of enlightened. We don't need God any longer because man has discovered that the universe is holistic. It's the same in outer space as it is on the planet. Earth is not the center of the universe. This is Copernicus and then later Galileo and Kepler discovered that the Earth was no longer the center as they thought it was in the medieval period, at least not in a physical sense of our solar system. And so ideas about science begin to change. Developments in discoveries, in medicine and technology begin to emerge. And in the 1700s, for example, there was a large movement of grave robbers because medicine was needing experiments. They needed to be able to do experiments, and so people would, rob graves and sell the bodies. This became a problem because the age of science and enlightenment. And then we moved into the 1800s, which is Romanticism, and that pushes back against the rationalism of the 1700s. The 1700s give rise to early industrialization, and we can see how mankind was not helped by this. You have the robber barons in the industrialization that brought people to the city, but then they lived in slums and they were controlled by the wealthy. And this gives rise to some of Marx's ideas in the 1800s, as well as the Romantics, that saw a return to nature and human emotion rather than human reason as an important concept. And this is also where we begin to see the rise of the state. So one idea sort of leads to another through these periods of history, and that leads us into the 1900s, where modernism, the early 1900s, modernism really takes off and becomes the preeminent idea that shaped the world. Now, what began to happen, say, in the 18th century, 1700s, and later 1700s, really, and then into the early 1900s, this period, 1789 to 1989, we had the world revolutions that I mentioned, French Revolution, the American War for Independence, which was quite a different sort of thing, but many have lumped it in there. You had the Bolsheviks in Russia. You had all sorts of revolutions against the old way of doing life, which was in Russia, it was against the czars, Nicholas, and those aristocratic people, just like in the French Revolution. And it was all now about the proletariat, or the man, the working classes, Marx would later on call them. It was the democratic idea that all men had a right. The natural rights of men, natural rights of women were written. And this began the suffrage movement and the first wave feminists with Mary Wollstonecraft and Emmeline Pankhurst as well. And Mary Wollstonecraft wrote the Natural Rights of Women. And I'm not saying the full title of that, but sort of she is Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. That's her mother. And so she sort of lays out this idea. Mary Wollstonecraft married a fellow that believed in things like open marriage, and so she sort of shared in these ideas. And this became, in the 1800s, sort of this pushing back against some of these were the early kind of rebels against the Victorian morality, and they began to sort of push back against these ideas. And they were also wrestling with things like, what do we do with this new technology, which is where Frankenstein comes in. Have we unleashed a monster that we can't control? And so there's lots of questions about the old way, what's happening in the new way. As I mentioned, industrialization begins to take over. We have people moving into the slums. The landlords would, both own the factories that people worked in and the housing that they lived in. So when you got a raise at your job, strangely, your rent would go up and people would be stuck there. And then this idea of objectivism, which is kind of strange because the idea of objectivism is the idea that human reason and empiricism are the order of the day. This is where we get the idea of scientism, that you hear people today say, follow the science. Science is the end all to be all. It is the new truth, even though science changes all the time. But it's also mixed with a kind of subjectivism that comes from language. So there's this sort of mixture where science is saying truth is objective, empirical evidence, and human reason, but at the same time, we all have our own morality, and we don't need to follow that kind of morality that we used to say was, that which guided the Ten Commandments, Judeo-Christian ethics that guided the Western world. And this, of course, erupts into two world wars. Interestingly, in 1914, the British Peace Commission wrote an article saying that war was now an anachronism, that Western culture had grown up. Nobody would ever go to war. We have this world market now, and people are able to get along. And by August of that same year, I think they wrote the article like in February, by August, we had the war to end all wars. We had the greatest world war ever. The largest war, including the most nations and people ever before. Nothing like it was ever seen like this before. This is why when you read Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, you have to imagine here's a man who was at the Somme in World War I and lost every single friend he went to high school with. C.S. Lewis also in World War I both were wounded, both lost everybody they knew. Or nearly everyone they knew in Lewis's case. And so this shook the world. Guns and tanks and machines and airplanes like we had never seen before. At the same time, you have radios, what C.S. Lewis calls the wireless. Radio becomes popular. The contraceptives come on the scene. Never before have there been anything like contraceptives. And so now modern man can really orient himself however he wants. Syphilis was rampant in the 1800s. Well, now we have penicillin, so now we can even stop the various STDs that come because of the immoral lifestyles. And so man is trying to conquer nature, but World War I shows that it's really just one man or a group of men using nature to conquer other people. That's why machines and things, the kind of military warcraft, devastated the world. And then within just a few years, 1939, we have World War II, and this shakes the 20th century. A fellow by the name of Mark Grief did some research work, and he shows that probably the number one book, the most published topic was what is man during the 20th century. What is man, or something about man? So you can think of like Invisible Man, all these works about mankind. Who is man? What is man like? What is this man who is both able to develop technology, but then use it to slaughter, kill people in mass, genocidal murder, like we'd never seen ever before in all the history of the world. And so these two world wars shook the modern world, and people wondering, what have we done? Where are we at? And so there was a lot of disconnect, a lot of isolation, a lot of alienation from those things that we had held dear as human beings. So trying to reconcile this technological advance and progress with the dehumanizing effects that came about because of it. And so this is really the fragmented kind of world that modernism is characterized by. Now, in the modern world, we have here a host of modern writers, and these, of course, aren't all the modern writers by any stretch of imagination, but these are some modern writers that you will probably be familiar with their names, and I'll just mention them Up in the top left corner, you see Virginia Woolf, who wrote To the Lighthouse and famous for a lot of her essays. Again, a feminist, women's suffrage, but mainly the idea of this modern thinking. Get rid of the old way, bring in the new. Joseph Conrad wrote, actually a Polish from Poland, learned to speak English, wrote very prolifically, and wrote several modern novels like The Heart of Darkness and Youth is a short story we're going to actually read in our class. And then you have there in the third from the left in the top row, this is Ezra Pound, who famously said, "Make it new." He's who made T.S. Eliot famous and published his work. On the right, you have James Joyce, who wrote Ulysses, which is a completely, it's written completely in streams of consciousness. So no longer are we giving, in the modern world, narrative description. Rather, we are introspectively just spilling everything that's in our minds and doing so in a way that's sort of chaotic and inconsistent. Then we have William Faulkner, who really wrote, sort of a Southern writer that wrestled with a lot of the ideas in the modern world that was displacing. So if you think about the late 1800s, you have this agricultural aristocratic South who relied on slavery, who is now being displaced, and there's a tension between blacks and whites in post-war period, and there is a large industrialization of the South. At one point in right after World War II, the 1940s, I forget which year, Georgia had 7 times the murder rate as New York City because of this tension. Black soldiers coming back from World War II, having fought for freedom, and now coming home to a racist sort of mentality that wanted to keep them in their place. They wanting to be liberated, not just from slavery, but also from the cultural mores that had kept them oppressed. And so Faulkner writes a lot about this coming of age of the South. We have a fellow here by the name of Ernest Hemingway, second from the left there on the bottom, For Whom the Bell Tolls. He was also a soldier before World War II, was part of what they call the Lost Generation, and he wrote a lot famous works and kind of popularized what we call the staccato sentence, that short, punchy, to the point sentence without a lot of extra, like, say, Dickens would write. So not verbose at all, but as staccato and close as you can. W.H. Auden there, third from the left on the bottom, famous poet, both in Britain and in the U.S., wrote a lot during that period, quite a volume, wrestled a lot with his own, sins and struggles, as well as his, volatile relationship with Catholicism and faith. And so he wrote a lot in his poetry. And then, of course, on the bottom right is T.S. Eliot, that wrote The Wasteland, famous work, The Hollow Men, and a poem that sort of characterizes the modern age as well, a little shorter than The Wasteland. And I'm going to read just a smidge here from the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. So think about this. In the modern world, instead of having high and lofty and noble kinds of characters and scenes, we have this very common, cityfied, vulgar, not in the necessarily inappropriate way, but vulgar in the common sense. So he says this: "Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights and one-night cheap hotels, and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. Streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. In the room the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. The yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, the yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window panes, licked its tongue in the corners of the evening, lingered upon the pools that stand in drains, let fall upon its back the soot that falls from chimneys, slipped by the terrace and made a sudden leap, and seeing that it was a soft October night, curled once and about the house and fell asleep. So you can see by this language here that this isn't very lofty, but rather sort of tedious and vulgar, and gives this kind of dirty feeling of walking through the grimy alleys of some city. The Wasteland here by T.S. Eliot was famous, and what is interesting is that Eliot, after basically writing The Wasteland and giving the world the picture of modernity, this disjointed, sort of symbolic and alienated, introspective poetry, he became a Christian and sort of upset the modern world. But modernist literature, as we've been talking, focuses on streams of consciousness rather than outward narrative. So it's all what's going on inside of a person's head, lots of disjointed things. So imagine in your own mind, we don't talk like we would talk, say, in a movie script where there's this dialogue that goes back and forth. Rather, we often say things that are sort of disjointed, and because we know each other, they come together. And yet at the same time, while we're talking, we're thinking about other things. And so imagine trying to put all that out on paper. And so the streams of consciousness rather than outward narrative become sort of a remarkable characteristic of modernist literature. Again, introspection, inward analysis. It's all about my feelings, what I'm thinking, who am I, my being, rather than where do I live, who are the people around me, what is this world that I live in. Alienation, which is this detachment and isolation, as you see in the language of J. Alfred Prufrock, somebody who's not really accepted. This is sort of this outcast idea. Common or vulgar language rather than the lofty prose of, say, Jane Austen. And then lots of symbolism. So everything has a sort of referential to something else. Eliot was known for being difficult to read. He wasn't very approachable in terms of people being able to access what he meant. So lots of symbolism and allusions. But others, some of Hemingway's work, sort of allude to things that, as you read it, you could pick up on it, still with a modernist bent, but a lot more symbolism. One of the big features of later 20th century, after World War II, was the use of the grotesque. This is something that's very important because the grotesque sort of points to this disjointed, self-divided, think of the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a Freudian kind of man who, like Gollum in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, this character who is at times good, but often evil, and, really a kind of division of personality going on. And this becomes another feature. Flannery O'Connor uses a lot of grotesque, and really as a commentary on the modern culture. So these are the modernist literature we're going to be reading this for the most part this year. And this gives you a little bit of an idea of what we're looking at and why it's important. And so look forward to seeing you in class and talking more about these big ideas.